Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to Shelf of Many Things, where I take a look at small press and indie RPGs. Now, I've covered a number of obscure variants on popular OSR systems in the past, but it occurred to me that I haven't really touched much on the way of big-name retroclones themselves. So I think I'll start taking a look at a few of those, sprinkled amongst other properties, of course, to keep things interesting. But first I'll start with Goblinoid Games' Labyrinth Lord. Now, Labyrinth Lord comes in a few different versions. This review will focus on the revised edition from Goblinoid Games, which is a retro clone based on the Moldvay Cook BX version of D&D. But there's also an advanced edition companion that seeks to add AD&D style rules to Labyrinth Lord, as well as a new advanced Labyrinth Lord that combines the two in one volume. I may take a look at those at a later date. The revised edition of Labyrinth Lord is available as both a PDF and a print-on-demand product, and has an art-free version available at no cost. Sadly, I never picked up a hard copy, so this will be based on the PDF version. Developed as a retro clone of BX by Dan Proctor back in 2007, the revised edition was released in 2009. It is one of the more widely adopted OSR systems for certain styles of play, and as such, a few Mega Dungeon products were explicitly created with compatibility with Labyrinth Lord in mind, although those were also more generally compatible with other OSR systems. In terms of technical details, Labyrinth Lord has a somewhat old-school presentation, with a two-color cover featuring a large black and white illustration, and then an interior layout featuring mostly double-column text, interspersed with the usual tables and black and white illustrations that are done in a style reminiscent of the late 70s and early 80s D&D books. The 140 pages are divided into 8 sections: the introduction, characters, spells, adventuring rules, encounters and combat, monsters, treasure, and finally, Labyrinth Lord lore. Now, I keep saying that Labyrinth Lord is a BX clone, and while it's faithful enough to the old system that you should be able to play most material from that era with it, there are some differences. Thus, while I'm going through an overview of the rules themselves, I'll focus on the major differences that pop up just to highlight where it diverges. With that said, let's take a look at the contents. The introduction goes into a basic description of RPG terminology in general and dice notation, as well as a brief table of common abbreviations and their meanings. Section 2 then goes directly into character creation. Labyrinth Lord uses the same classic 6 stats as D&D of years past: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, using a basic 3d6 method for stat generation with a spread of plus to minus 3 adjustments. It includes the ability to trade stats on a 2-for-1 basis to increase a character's prime requisite, once a class is chosen at least, with a few limitations. Character classes include the basic 4 of Cleric, Thief, Fighter, and Magic User, but also the race as classes introduced in basic D&D, the Dwarf, the Elf, and the Halfling. Differences here include the fact that the core human classes have progression all the way up to level 20, whereas the original BX tended to only have the basic tables go up to level 14. I understand that basic BX also gave rules for extrapolating XP to 36 in the text, but the tables themselves stopped at around 14. Also, clerics get their spells starting at level 1 rather than level 2, and higher level spells are available in Labyrinth Lord due to the increased level range. Whereas BX cut off at 5 for clerics and 6 for magic users in terms of spell levels, Labyrinth Lord includes levels 6 and 7 for clerics and 7 to 9 for magic users. Alignment uses the basic Law-Chaos access only, and the character creation section concludes with a brief equipment section that covers most of the basic gear, weapons, armor, adventuring equipment, and such that a character might want. There's also some optional rules for character inheritance, since characters can perish rather easily in Labyrinth Lord, and that at least affords some way to leave important equipment and wealth for later characters. The spell section covers both cleric and magic user spells and contains what you might expect of an OSR spell list. Rules are brief and to the point and include the idea of reversible spells, allowing some spells such as cure and inflict wound type spells to share one entry. Each spell has a name, a level, a duration, a range, and then a description to say what it actually does. The spells in Labyrinth Lord tend to be a little bit more complex than those in simpler rules light versions of OSR games, but less complex by far than more modern standards of spell systems. When a spell did not have a BX version in the case of higher level spells, it seems that they used the AD&D version as a base in such instances rather than BECMI versions, at least from what I can tell, although even those were changed somewhat based on the core number of spells that are available. Section 4 covers general adventuring rules, starting with guidelines on forming a party, and then going on towards actual crunch rules for dungeon crawling. Labyrinth Lord uses a 10-second round with a 10-minute turn scheme, with movement rates and light durations comparable with other OSR offerings. There are rules for bashing stuck doors using a D6 modified by strength bonus, and there's rules for spotting secret doors, as well as listening at doors and detecting traps, even for non-thief characters. There's basic rules for wilderness exploration and getting lost, for dealing with rations and foraging for food, as well as for swimming and water and air travel. There's some basic rules for hiring adventuring retainers, which is important in an old school game, as many adventurers kind of presume characters travel with an entire entourage. And there's rules for mercenaries and specialists, which are actually more suited towards keeping things safe away from the dungeon, such as in a character's stronghold or home. The section ends with some basic rules on calculating experience, and Labyrinth Lord does use a experience scheme where you get experience for treasure on a 1-for-1 gold piece value basis. Section 5 covers encounters and combat. There is a basic surprise roll using a d6, and initiative also uses a d6 for each side, determine each individual round, with optional rules for individual character initiative. There's a monster reaction table for monsters that may not always attack, basic rules for combat movement, including long-term chases, both underground and in the wilderness. Combat itself is phased, with each side doing movement, then missile attacks, then spells, and finally melee each turn, using back and forth alternative turns between sides, at least in a particular round. Basic attacks, both ranged and melee, follow the pattern of pretty much every sort of OSR game out there, with an attack roll versus an attack matrix, with Labyrinth Lord specifically using descending AC as in years past. Interestingly, Labyrinth Lord defaults to the 1d6 damage for each attack roll, but that only bears a light mention compared with the rather extensive rules for the variable damage dice that was introduced in BX, such that the optional variable damage dice rule actually seems to take precedence. There's rules for aerial combat as well as for healing damage. Saving throws follow the old school named category scheme with the 5 categories of breath attacks, poison or death, petrify or paralyze, wands, and finally spells or spell-like devices. Now, if you've played any sort of old school D&D or a similar retroclone, these should be relatively familiar to you. While there are no skills in Labyrinth Lord, there are optional rules for ability checks to accomplish tasks, as well as optional morale rules to determine which monsters and NPCs surrender or flee. Labyrinth Lord also includes rules for naval combat. Section 6 includes Monster List, which include many classic non-product identity monsters in a format similar to old school D&D, although with more meat on the bones, so to speak, than many of the rules light systems, at least the ones that I've looked at. Each monster entry has a name, the number encountered, as well as the number encountered in a monster lair, the monster's alignment, their movement, their armor class, hit dice, number of attacks, the damage they do with each attack, what saving throw entry they use, their morale, their treasure hoard class, and finally the experience value of the monster. This is followed by a few paragraphs of description of the monster and whatever tactics and special rules might be required. Not every monster has artwork, but there's a fair amount of general monster artwork scattered throughout the creature entries themselves. This section concludes with some very basic, generic random monster tables that you can use to whip up a dungeon or an adventure in a pinch. Section 7 has a treasure list, starting with horde categories that list what coins, jewelry, and potential magic items can be found in each horde class. These are very similar to the treasure types used in old school D&D, but used Roman numerals instead of letters. Otherwise, they have a very similar spread of value. Tables for random gems, jewelry, and magic items follow, with magic items being very typical for basic D&D fare, with magic weapons and armor bonuses ranging up to about +3, whereas there's actually some cursed items scattered throughout the basic tables. Items themselves generally only have about a paragraph of description or so, being on the relatively simple side in terms of rules and design. There are, however, rules for sapient swords with special abilities towards the end. The last section, Section 8, is a Labyrinth Lord lore compendium, which is basically a GM's miscellany. It covers dungeon design and adventure design in general. There's rules for randomly stocking a dungeon and randomly generating groups of NPCs, although no real rules for actually randomly generating the dungeon itself. There are guidelines for designing wilderness areas with a hex map. There's rules for new spell and new item creation, at least it's touched on a little bit, they're not really detailed rules. And there's some very basic costs listed for creating strongholds. There's some general GM advice on how to approach certain things that may crop up during a game, at least at the table. And finally, a sample stocked dungeon, or Labyrinth as they're called in Labyrinth Lord. So all in all, Labyrinth Lord is a very faithful adaptation of the original BX rules, yet it expands upon them in such a way as to allow play over a longer campaign, into slightly higher character levels than the original BX rules at least natively supported. Like the original BX rules, Labyrinth Lord is very well suited towards your typical dungeon crawl focused game. I'd almost say more so than some of the more complex OSR systems are. While it does have support for more overland gaming, a lot of that level of play is left to the GM's rulings. In my opinion, Labyrinth Lord is well written, succinct, and clear about the rules, and any balance issues that may remain within it, or the legacy of the system which it attempts to emulate. One of the strengths is that it does present a complete fantasy role-playing experience in an easy-to-digest format, which you may have actually seen in my BX video review way back when, in my D&D retrospective. The same applies here. Another of its strengths is that it is simple enough to expand upon where necessary. This is evidenced by the Advanced Edition Companion, which sits right on top of the basic Labyrinth Lord rules and just kind of plugs in to add the complexity of the AD&D game as necessary. I don't currently run a Labyrinth Lord game, but I have in the past, and I found that it was extremely easy to handle with combats that played out very quickly, and it was extremely rapid to roll up new characters as necessary. I will say that it does capture that old school era feel where combat was fairly deadly, so it would behoove a group to try to avoid combat where they can. I found that it's also an extremely easy system to teach to people who have never played a role-playing game before, and it's honestly easier for me to read and reference than the original Moldvay cookbooks. All in all, I can see why Labyrinth Lord was a popular system to base some dungeon crawl scenarios off of, and the availability of the free art version can readily allow a group of players to try out some old school gaming on the cheap. I would highly recommend it for those who want a solid OSR retroclone without going all the way back to White Box era. I think it holds up even now over a decade after its release. And on that note, I'll leave it here. Links to where you can check it out will be in the description below. This has been the RPG Crawler with the Shelf of Many Things, Labyrinth Lord. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye.